There is a sentence that Andrew Carnegie wrote in 1889 that has been quoted so many times in so many different contexts that it has taken on the quality of a proverb. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. It is a remarkable sentence for a man who had spent the previous 4 decades accumulating one of the largest private fortunes in the history of the world to write. It is even more remarkable when you understand the specific circumstances under which Carnegie had accumulated that fortune. The wages he had paid, the hours he had imposed, the union he had destroyed, the men who had died in his mills. The man who wrote that the wealthy had a moral obligation to give away their money before they died had built the wealth he was proposing to give away on a foundation of industrial practices that his own workers, had they been asked, would have characterized in terms considerably less elevated than a philosophical essay in the North American Review. But that is the Carnegie story in miniature. The gap between the philosophy and the practice. The distance between the man who endowed over 2,000 public libraries across the English-speaking world and the man who authorized the measures that produced the Homestead Massacre of 1892. The distance between those two versions of the same person is not a simple story of hypocrisy, though hypocrisy is part of it. It is a story about the specific moral architecture of the Gilded Age, the period of American industrial expansion between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, in which the accumulation of private wealth on a previously unimaginable scale and the human cost of that accumulation existed in such close proximity that the people doing the accumulating had to develop extraordinarily sophisticated intellectual frameworks to avoid seeing the connection too clearly. Carnegie developed the most sophisticated of those frameworks. He called it the Gospel of Wealth, and it is the most revealing document in the history of American industrial capitalism, not because it is dishonest, though it is dishonest in important ways, but because it is so genuinely believed. Carnegie actually thought that what he was describing was right, that the concentration of wealth in the hands of the most capable was not just inevitable but beneficial, that the rich man was a trustee of his wealth on behalf of society, that the obligation to give was not just moral but practical, a mechanism through which the superior judgment of the successful could be deployed in the service of the less successful in ways that the less successful, left to their own devices, would not be capable of deploying themselves. It was a philosophy of genuine generosity built on a foundation of genuine contempt. And Carnegie held both with equal sincerity for his entire life. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a weaver's cottage that the introduction of the power loom had made economically obsolete by the time of his birth. His father William was a handloom weaver whose skill and whose livelihood were simultaneously being destroyed by the same process of industrial mechanization that his son would eventually drive to its furthest extreme. The family emigrated to the United States in 1848, when Carnegie was 13, settling in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, where relatives had already established themselves. The America they arrived in was not the America of Carnegie's eventual triumph. It was the America of hard manual labor, of immigrant poverty, of a boy working 12-hour days in a cotton factory for $1.20 a week to help support a family that had crossed an ocean to escape destitution and found something uncomfortably similar waiting for them on the other side. Carnegie worked in the cotton factory, then as a telegraph messenger boy, then as a telegraph operator, learning the technology with the same focused intensity that Edison was developing simultaneously 200 miles to the east and that the telegraph seemed to produce in a particular kind of intelligent young man with no formal education and no other path to advancement. His skill as a telegraph operator brought him to the attention of Thomas Scott, the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division, who hired Carnegie as his personal telegraph operator and secretary in 1853. Carnegie was 18 years old. The connection to Scott, and through Scott to the Pennsylvania Railroad and to the investment opportunities that access to the most powerful transportation company in America made available, was the foundation on which everything else was built. Scott taught Carnegie that the real money was not in working but in investing, that the wage, however generous, was the return on the investment of time and labor, and that time and labor were finite resources that could only generate finite returns. Capital, properly deployed, was different. Capital could work while you slept. Capital compounded. Capital, in the hands of someone who understood where the economy was going before it got there, could generate returns that no wage earner, however talented, could match. Scott helped Carnegie make his first investment, in a sleeping car company that proved spectacularly profitable, by lending him the money for the initial stake when Carnegie did not have the funds himself. The lesson Carnegie drew from this experience was one he never forgot. The system rewards those who own things. The surest path from owning nothing to owning everything is to identify the right thing to own at the right moment and to have the courage and the credit to acquire it before the rest of the world understands its value. What Carnegie identified, in the years immediately following the Civil War, was steel. Not just steel as a product, but steel as the defining material of the next phase of American industrial development. The railroads that were stitching the continent together needed steel rails. The bridges that were crossing the rivers needed steel girders. The buildings that were beginning to rise above the traditional height limits of masonry construction needed steel frames. The ships that were replacing the wooden sailing vessels of the previous era needed steel hulls. Steel was everywhere that the modern world was being built, and the supply of steel was not keeping pace with the demand for it. Carnegie saw this gap between supply and demand in the mid-1860s and spent the next decade positioning himself to fill it. He visited England in 1872 and saw for the first time the Bessemer converter in industrial operation. The Bessemer process, which converted pig iron into steel by blowing air through the molten metal to burn off impurities, had been developed in the 1850s and was already transforming British steel production. American steel makers had been slower to adopt it, held back by the conservatism of established iron producers and the capital costs of the new equipment. Carnegie saw the Bessemer converter and understood immediately that it was the future. He returned to America and began building what would become the Carnegie Steel Company around the Bessemer process, at a scale and with a commitment to operational efficiency that no American competitor had previously attempted. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works, which Carnegie opened near Pittsburgh in 1875 and named after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in a piece of commercial flattery so brazen that it almost qualifies as a work of art in its own right, was the first steel plant in America designed from the ground up to operate the Bessemer process at full industrial scale. It was also the embodiment of a management philosophy that Carnegie had been developing since his days with the Pennsylvania Railroad and that he applied to steel production with a rigor that his competitors found simultaneously admirable and terrifying. Cut costs. Always cut costs. Cut them when business is good because the margin you preserve will be your advantage when business turns bad. Cut them when business is bad because the competitor who survives a downturn with lower costs than you has won a structural advantage that the next upturn will make permanent. The only number that matters is the cost per ton. Watch it every day. Know it better than you know anything else. And never stop finding ways to make it smaller. This philosophy made Carnegie Steel the most efficient steel producer in the world within a decade of its founding. It also made it one of the most demanding industrial environments that American workers had ever encountered. The efficiency that Carnegie pursued with such relentless discipline was not generated by machines alone. It was generated by the men who ran the machines, who worked 12-hour shifts in conditions of extreme heat and physical danger, who were paid wages that Carnegie's cost-cutting philosophy kept as low as the labor market would permit, and who had, until 1892, the protection of a union that had negotiated the terms of their employment with enough force to maintain a standard of living that the most skilled among them could describe, carefully, as decent. In 1892, that protection ended. And the way it ended tells you more about Andrew Carnegie than anything he ever wrote in the North American Review. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is the event that sits at the center of the Carnegie story like a stone in a stream, dividing everything that came before it from everything that came after, forcing anyone who wants to tell the full story of Andrew Carnegie to stop and account for what happened on the banks of the Monongahela River in the summer of that year. It is not possible to tell the Carnegie story honestly without it. It is not possible to understand the gospel of wealth without understanding what the man who wrote it was willing to do to workers who asked for a living wage in the same year he was publishing his philosophy of industrial benevolence. The two things are not separate chapters in the Carnegie story. They are the same chapter, and the only honest way to read it is to hold them together. The Homestead Steel Works, located 8 miles upstream from Pittsburgh on the south bank of the Monongahela River, was one of the most productive steel plants in the world by the early 1890s. It employed approximately 4,000 workers, of whom the most skilled, the men who operated the converting furnaces and rolled the steel and performed the technical operations that required years of training and experience to master, were represented by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the most powerful trade unions in America at the time. The Amalgamated had negotiated a contract with Carnegie Steel that provided its members with wages tied to the price of steel, rising when steel prices rose and falling when they fell, within a floor and ceiling that the union had bargained for over years of negotiation. By 1892 the contract was up for renewal. The man Carnegie had put in charge of the Homestead Works was Henry Clay Frick, his business partner and the most effective and most ruthless industrial manager of the Gilded Age. Frick was not a complicated man in the way that Carnegie was complicated. He did not write philosophical essays about the responsibilities of wealth. He did not endow libraries or concert halls or express any visible concern about how history would judge him. He wanted to break the union, not to renegotiate the contract on more favorable terms, not to reduce the wage floor to something the business could sustain through a steel price downturn, to break it, to eliminate it, to operate Homestead as a non-union plant in which Carnegie Steel set the wages and the conditions and the workers accepted them or found employment elsewhere. This was Frick's objective, and he pursued it with a directness that Carnegie, who understood the public relations consequences of being seen to destroy a union, preferred to manage from a careful distance. Carnegie's distance, in the summer of 1892, was literal. He was in Scotland, at his castle at Cluny, ostensibly on vacation but in constant telegraphic communication with Frick about the developing situation at Homestead. The letters and telegrams that passed between them in the weeks before the strike have been preserved and studied by historians, and they tell a story that Carnegie spent the rest of his life trying to complicate but never entirely managed to deny. He supported Frick's strategy. He had approved the decision to post new wage scales that the union could not accept. He had agreed to the plan to shut down the plant and lock out the workers if the union refused the new terms. He had, in the most direct sense available to a man who was not physically present, authorized what happened next. What happened next began on June 28, 1892, when Frick locked the workers out of the Homestead plant and surrounded it with a fence topped with barbed wire and equipped with rifle ports, which the workers immediately christened Fort Frick. Frick then contracted with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency for 300 armed guards to be transported to the plant by barge up the Monongahela River in the early morning hours of July 6th, to take possession of the works and enable the importation of replacement workers, strikebreakers, who would operate the plant without the union. The workers at Homestead had been watching the river. When the two barges carrying the Pinkerton men appeared in the pre-dawn darkness of July 6th, thousands of workers and their families were waiting on the riverbank. What followed was a battle, not a metaphorical confrontation but an actual battle, fought with rifles and pistols and improvised weapons on the riverbank and in the river itself, that lasted for most of the day and left 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton guards dead, with dozens wounded on both sides. The Pinkerton men, caught on the barges in the river under fire from the bank, eventually surrendered and were marched through a gauntlet of furious workers and family members that the accounts of the day describe with a specificity of violence that newspapers of the period printed with apparent shock and that their readers consumed with a mixture of horror and recognition. The Pennsylvania governor, Robert Patterson, responded to the battle by deploying 8,000 National Guard troops to Homestead, which ended the workers' control of the plant and allowed Frick to import the replacement workers and resume production. The Union leadership was arrested and charged with murder and various other offenses, none of which ultimately resulted in convictions, but all of which consumed the Union's financial resources and organizational capacity in legal defense at exactly the moment when it needed those resources for other things. The strike continued until November, when the workers, exhausted and financially broken, returned to work on the company's terms. The Amalgamated Association was effectively destroyed at Homestead. It would be decades before steel workers in America had meaningful union representation again. Andrew Carnegie received the news of the July 6th battle while in Scotland and wrote to Frick expressing his support. His public position was that he had not been involved in the decisions that led to the confrontation, and that he regretted the violence. His private position, visible in the telegrams, was rather different. He had been involved. He had not regretted the strategy, only the public relations consequences of its execution. And he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who had been managing public perception of himself for his entire career, that the distance he had maintained by being in Scotland was not just a personal convenience but a deliberate structural element of the strategy. Frick would take the public blame. Carnegie would take the strategic benefit. And Carnegie Steel would operate free of union constraint for the next decade. Frick took the blame, and he took something else. In July 1892, 3 weeks after the battle on the riverbank, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's office in Pittsburgh, shot him twice, and stabbed him 3 times before being subdued by Frick's staff. Frick survived, conducting business from his office chair while his wounds were treated, in a display of physical stoicism that even his enemies acknowledged as remarkable. The assassination attempt, intended by Berkman as an act of revolutionary solidarity with the Homestead workers, actually damaged the workers' cause by allowing the press and the public to associate the strike with political violence and to treat the union's grievances as the precursor to anarchist terror rather than as legitimate labor disputes that deserved serious consideration. Carnegie used the Homestead aftermath to accelerate the expansion of Carnegie Steel with a thoroughness that demonstrated what union-free operation actually meant in practice. Wages were cut. Hours were extended. The 12-hour shift, which the amalgamated had been pushing to reduce, remained standard. The specific technical knowledge that the skilled union workers had possessed, knowledge about how to operate the furnaces and rollers that had given them negotiating leverage because the company could not easily replace it, was systematically desk-killed through the introduction of new machinery and new processes that required less expertise and could therefore be performed by cheaper and more easily replaceable labor. The efficiency gains that Carnegie had always pursued were now achievable without the constraint that the union had imposed, and Carnegie Steel's cost per ton fell to levels that made it the most competitive steel producer in the world and that his competitors, operating with unionized workforces, could not match. The profits that resulted from this competitive advantage accumulated at a rate that surprised even Carnegie. By the late 1890s, Carnegie Steel was generating annual profits of tens of millions of dollars, a figure that would grow to $40 million in the year 1900 alone. Carnegie's personal share of these profits made him, by any reasonable measure, the wealthiest private individual in the world. And Carnegie, who had been writing and thinking about the responsibilities of wealth since the 1880s, was acutely aware that the gospel of wealth he had articulated required him to do something with this accumulation beyond simply possessing it. The something he chose to do was libraries. The decision to fund public libraries as his primary philanthropic vehicle was not arbitrary. It reflected Carnegie's own experience of self-education through access to borrowed books, and his genuine belief that access to knowledge was the mechanism through which the talented poor could elevate themselves in the way that he himself had been elevated. Colonel James Anderson of Allegheny, Pennsylvania, had opened his private library to working boys on Saturdays when Carnegie was young, and Carnegie credited this access with giving him the intellectual foundation that his formal schooling had not provided. The library program was, in this sense, genuinely personal. It was not simply a tax-efficient mechanism for the disposition of surplus capital. It was an expression of something Carnegie actually believed about how poverty could be escaped and how society could be improved. But the library program was also, and Carnegie was sophisticated enough to understand this even if he never said it directly, an extraordinarily effective mechanism for the conversion of an industrial fortune built on the suppression of workers' rights into a legacy of civic beneficence that subsequent generations would encounter entirely separately from its origins. The Carnegie Library in your town, the building with the name carved in stone above the door, was built by the same man who sent Pinkerton guards up the Monongahela River to break a strike. But the library does not say that. The library says Carnegie. And Carnegie, over time, has come to mean the libraries and the concert halls and the universities rather than the barbed wire fence and the rifle ports and the 7 workers who died on the riverbank in July 1892. That conversion, from industrial villain to civic benefactor, from the man who broke Homestead to the man who built your library, is the most impressive financial transaction in the Carnegie story. More impressive than the Bessemer converter or the cost per ton or the $40 million in annual profit. Because it was conducted not in steel or in money but in memory. And memory, as Carnegie understood better than almost anyone of his generation, is the ultimate long-term investment. It compounds across centuries. And it pays dividends that no steel mill ever could. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie sold Carnegie Steel to J. Pierpont Morgan for $480 million. It was the largest private financial transaction in the history of the world to that point. Morgan combined Carnegie's operation with several other steel companies to create United States Steel, the first corporation in American history to be capitalized at over $1 billion, a figure so large that it required the invention of new language to describe it. Carnegie's personal share of the sale was approximately $225 million, delivered in gold bonds, which made him at the stroke of a pen the wealthiest private individual in the world by a margin that his nearest competitors could not approach. He was 65 years old. He had spent 50 years building the fortune. He now had, by his own philosophy, the rest of his life to give it away. And the giving away, which occupied the final 18 years of his life until his death in 1919, was conducted with the same systematic efficiency, the same obsessive attention to scale and impact, the same refusal to be satisfied with the merely adequate when the extraordinary was achievable, that had characterized the accumulation. Carnegie gave away approximately $350 million before he died, roughly 90% of his peak fortune, in a philanthropic program whose scope and ambition had no precedent in the history of private wealth. The libraries came first and remained the most visible element of the program. 2,509 public library buildings funded across the English-speaking world, from the industrial cities of Pennsylvania to the small towns of Scotland, from the suburbs of Sydney to the villages of New Zealand. The requirement Carnegie attached to the library grants was a piece of practical philosophy that revealed his understanding of how institutions survive. He would pay for the building. The local government had to provide the land and commit to funding the ongoing operation. No commitment, no library. This condition was not generosity with strings attached in the negative sense. It was Carnegie's understanding that a gift without local ownership and local investment was a gift that would not endure. The libraries he funded that survived into the 21st century did so because local communities had been required from the beginning to take responsibility for them. The ones that did not survive, and some did not, failed in most cases because the local commitment had been insufficient or had been withdrawn. The condition was not a control mechanism. It was a survival mechanism. Beyond the libraries, Carnegie funded universities and research institutions with a generosity that transformed the American educational landscape. The Carnegie Institute of Technology, founded in Pittsburgh in 1900, became Carnegie Mellon University, one of the leading research universities in the world. The Carnegie Institution of Washington, founded in 1902, funded scientific research in astronomy, geology, biology, and embryology, producing work of genuine significance across multiple disciplines. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, founded in 1910, was perhaps the most revealing of all his philanthropic institutions, reflecting Carnegie's genuine and somewhat naive belief that rational argument and institutional pressure could eliminate war as a mechanism for resolving disputes between nations. He lived to see the First World War begin and continued, with a persistence that his friends found heartbreaking, to believe that it would end quickly through negotiation rather than running for 4 years and killing 17 million people. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, founded in 1911 as the umbrella institution for his philanthropic giving, was the most structurally innovative of his philanthropic creations. Carnegie endowed it with $125 million and gave its board the authority to make grants across any field that its members judged beneficial to humanity. This was an extraordinary act of institutional trust for a man who had spent his career maintaining absolute personal control over his operations. The corporation outlasted its founder by over a century and has made grants totaling billions of dollars across education, international peace, democracy, and a range of other fields that Carnegie specified only in the broadest terms. It is, in the most literal sense, the ongoing expression of Carnegie's belief that accumulated private wealth properly deployed through institutional mechanisms could improve the world more effectively than any government program. The question that the Carnegie philanthropic legacy forces onto the table, and that it has never quite managed to answer to everyone's satisfaction, is whether the giving was sufficient to redeem the getting. Whether the libraries cancel the homestead. Whether the Carnegie Mellon University and the Carnegie Hall and the 2,500 libraries are adequate compensation for the 12-hour shifts and the wage cuts and the Pinkerton guards and the 7 men who died on the riverbank. This is not a question that admits a clean answer. It is not a question of arithmetic, where you can add up the dollars given and subtract the dollars extracted and determine a net moral position. It is a question about the nature of wealth and the nature of moral obligation and the specific circumstances under which the acquisition of one justifies the consequences of the other. Carnegie's answer, articulated most fully in the Gospel of Wealth but visible in everything he did and said in the last decades of his life, was that the giving did redeem the getting. Not because the libraries compensated the workers, which they did not in any direct financial sense, but because the deployment of the accumulated wealth in the service of public education and institutional development created more value for society than would have been possible if the wealth had been distributed directly to the workers who helped create it, spent by them on their own immediate consumption, and thereby dissipated without the institutional impact that Carnegie's concentrated deployment achieved. This was the argument. It was not dishonest. It was genuinely believed. And it was also, in ways that Carnegie never fully acknowledged, an argument that was extremely convenient for the person making it. The workers at Homestead did not have access to Carnegie's philanthropic institutions in any direct or meaningful sense. The library in a town they had never visited was not compensation for the wage they were paid. The university that bore Carnegie's name educated the children of the middle class and the wealthy, not the children of the men who had worked the converting furnaces and been locked out of the plant in 1892. The Homestead Massacre was a local and immediate event with local and immediate victims whose lives were damaged in specific and concrete ways. The philanthropy was a national and eventually global program whose benefits were diffuse, delayed, and distributed according to Carnegie's judgment rather than according to any democratic process that the affected workers could have participated in. This gap between the scale and immediacy of the harm and the diffuse and delayed character of the benefit is the central moral problem of the Carnegie legacy and the central moral problem of the philanthropic model that Carnegie invented and that American industrial capitalism has continued to employ ever since. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Each of them represents the same basic transaction. Wealth accumulated through processes that have costs which are not borne by the accumulator. Wealth then deployed philanthropically according to the accumulator's judgment about what is beneficial. The workers who bear the costs of the accumulation do not vote on how the philanthropic deployment is conducted. The public whose tax system subsidizes the philanthropic giving through charitable deductions does not determine its priorities. The judgment is the billionaire's. The benefit, in theory, is society's. The cost, always, is someone else's. Carnegie understood this critique. He had versions of it directed at him during his lifetime by labor organizers and progressive politicians and journalists who found the combination of industrial exploitation and philanthropic benevolence morally incoherent. His response was always a version of the same argument. The accumulation was the necessary precondition of the deployment. You could not build 2,000 libraries without first building a steel empire. You could not fund the Carnegie Institution without first implementing the cost structures that made Carnegie Steel the most profitable operation in the world. The ends justified the means not in the crude sense that any outcome justifies any method, but in the more sophisticated sense that the specific outcome achieved, the specific institutional infrastructure built, the specific educational access provided, was only achievable through the specific methods of accumulation that critics found objectionable. It was a powerful argument in 1900. It is a powerful argument today. And it is no more finally persuasive today than it was when Carnegie first made it. Because the question it never adequately answers is why the workers who generated the wealth should not have had a voice in how it was used. Why the people whose 12-hour shifts and suppressed wages and destroyed union provided the capital that built the libraries should have been required to accept Carnegie's judgment about what was beneficial for society rather than having the resources to make their own judgments about what was beneficial for themselves. Carnegie's answer was that his judgment was better. The gospel of wealth is, at its foundation, an argument about superior judgment. The man who accumulated the wealth demonstrated by that very accumulation that his judgment was superior to that of the men who did not accumulate it. And superior judgment should control superior resources. It is the most honest and most uncomfortable thing Carnegie ever wrote. Not the part about dying disgraced. That was the public-facing philosophy, the part that was designed to be quoted and admired. The honest part was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that the judgment of the man who wins the competition of industrial capitalism is the judgment that should govern the deployment of its fruits. That success is not just a financial outcome but a moral credential. That the man who builds the steel empire has demonstrated, by building it, that his vision of the good is worth more than the vision of the men who worked in it. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919 in Lenox, Massachusetts, having given away the vast majority of his fortune and having failed, in the final years of his life, to prevent the First World War that his Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had been designed to make impossible. He was 83 years old. He had been born in a weaver's cottage made obsolete by industrial machinery, and he died in a Massachusetts mansion made possible by the most efficient steel operation in the history of the world. In between those 2 points he had crossed an ocean, taught himself telegraphy, learned from Thomas Scott that capital was the thing that mattered, built an empire on the Bessemer converter and the 12-hour shift and the suppression of the Amalgamated Association, sold that empire to J.P. Morgan for the largest sum ever paid for a private company, and spent the remaining 18 years of his life building libraries in towns he had never visited for people he would never meet. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. He did not die rich. He died having given away more money than almost anyone in the history of the world. Whether that was sufficient to avoid the disgrace he had identified as the consequence of dying rich is a question that the Carnegie libraries cannot answer. They can only ask it, in stone, above their doors, in every town where his name is carved in a building that stands on the corner of a street where no one remembers the Monongahela riverbank or the names of the 7 men who died on it in July 1892. The libraries are beautiful. The names are gone. That was always the plan.